Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Royal Society for this evening's Wilkins-Bernal-Medawar Prize Lecture. It's actually the 2018 Prize Lecture. There are one or two housekeeping announcements. Could you make sure your mobile phones are off? That would be great. And there are no planned fire evacuations. So if you hear a fire alarm, you have to leg it very quickly, either out the back or through this door here, because it means there's a real fire. The event is being live streamed and it's being recorded for the Society's archives, and there will be live subtitling for the hard of hearing. So it's a pleasure and a privilege to introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Mark Jackson, to give the 2018 lecture. This is a prize that is given for excellence in presenting the social function of sciences, the philosophy of science, or the history of science. And Professor Jackson can count himself amongst a list of exceptional historians, philosophers, and science communicators, including Michaela Massimi, John Agar, Roger Highfield, Melvyn Bragg, and Jeremy Butterfield, to name just a few. So Mark is Professor of History of Medicine at the University of Exeter, where he's the director of the Wellcome Centre for Cultures and Environments of Health. The centre focuses on fostering collaboration across the humanities, social sciences, health research, and with the public. So remarkably, Professor Jackson trained as an immunologist and as a medical doctor at St. Thomas's before beginning his career in the history of medicine. He's played a key role in popularizing medical history and the medical humanities more broadly. He's the chair of the World Health Organization Europe External Advisory Group on Cultural Contexts of Health, and he's committed to deepening the educational and policy impact of research in the medical humanities. So Professor Jackson has served on several Wellcome Trust committees and was senior academic advisor in medical humanities. So he's recognized as a leader of historical research and chairs the history subpanel for REF 2021. For academics, this is very important because this is where the money comes from. His research and publications have helped to shape the field of the history of medicine, and he's published several books on the history of infanticide, allergic diseases, stress, and is currently writing a book, appropriately, about the history of the midlife crisis. So this evening he brings us Life Begins at 40, the biological and cultural roots of the midlife crisis. So please join me in welcoming Professor Mark Jackson.
Thank you, John, for those very kind words. It's an absolute pleasure to be here tonight. It's an honor to be speaking at the Royal Society, so thank you very much for inviting me. I have to say that I had not expected so many people to be here, so thank you very much for coming as well. We know, particularly at the Royal Society, that in terms of knowledge production, we always stand on the shoulders of giants. There are always people who have gone before us. But there are people who walk beside us on whom we depend as well. And before I start, I want to thank three institutions. The first is the Wellcome Trust. The Wellcome Trust has funded a large proportion of my research and my research career, from the very early stages, converting from a doctor into an early career researcher, throughout various larger program grants, strategic awards, and more recently the Trust has supported the creation of the Wellcome Centre for Cultures and Environments of Health. In many ways, for me, this was the fulfillment of a dream, although at times the responsibilities and demands seem more like a nightmare. But it's a fantastic opportunity, and I'm deeply grateful for the Trust for the funding, and it's nice that Simon Chaplin is here as well, so thank you for coming. I'm also deeply fortunate that I have worked at the University of Exeter for over 20 years. We know from the tagline that Exeter is probably the best university in the world. And for me, it has been fantastic. A place to grow as an academic, a place to develop, to try out new ideas. The senior management at the university, Steve Smith, the Vice-Chancellor, Janice Kay, the Provost, Nick Talbot before he left, and now Neil Gow, that senior group leading the university have been fantastic. They have supported and encouraged me and been prepared to take a risk or two to support one or two of my more grandiose ideas. I also want to thank Andrew Thorpe, who's the Dean of the College of Humanities, who's been a fantastic scholar and friend for many, many years. The final institution that I want to thank is the institution that is my family. I didn't get where I am today without my wife, Siobhan, wonderfully loyal, faithful, tolerant of my own crises throughout our marriage. Our three children, Ciara, Regan and Connell, the best children. These together are the why and the how of my life. So thank you. It may seem strange to be standing in the Royal Society giving a lecture about a subject like the midlife crisis. This is an institution renowned for its world-leading scientific research. But I hope that what I have to say will do justice to the three figures after whom this lecture is named. John Wilkins, of course, a natural philosopher, a polymath, one of the founders of the Society. John Desmond Bernal, an Irish scientist renowned for his work in X-ray crystallography in molecular biology, but also a very committed and prolific historian of science, interested in the relationship between science and society. Peter Medawar, really most famous for his work on immunological tolerance, for which he received the Nobel Prize in 1960. What is less well known about Medawar's work, he was also interested in aging, aging as an unsolved biological problem, as he put it in his inaugural lecture in 1951. And one of the terms that Medawar used to describe the aging process was senescence. And that concept of senescence had been popularized by an American psychologist, Granville Stanley Hall, in the early 20th century. And it came to be one of the key ways in which midlife and middle age was defined. During the early 20th century, middle age came to represent the period between adolescence and senescence. And that's why many people refer to it as middlescence, middle age as middlescence. So, although it's a strange subject to be talking about at the Royal Society, I hope that it will do justice to these three figures here after whom the lecture is named. Let me take you back, and some of you will remember this, let me take you back to the late 1970s, to an iconic sitcom television series on BBC, The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin, starring Leonard Rossiter. And the television series was based on a novel by the English comic writer David Nobbs. Reggie Perrin, Reginald Iolanthe Perrin, R.I.P., was 46 years old, married to his wife Elizabeth, living in a near-Georgian house in the Surrey suburbs. They had two children, both grown up, leaving their parents living in a house that was perhaps not quite or no longer a home. Reggie commuted every weekday up to Waterloo Station, walked across the bridge, went to work at Sunshine Desserts as a middle manager, as a bureaucrat. And at the start of the novel, Reggie is depressed. He's disillusioned and distressed, disaffected, disillusioned with his life, disillusioned with his wife, disillusioned with his work. And he begins to behave rather randomly. He starts sending off aggressive memos to his colleagues. He tries to have an affair with his secretary. He begins to get more irascible. And one day while his wife is out, he decides that he's going to collect all his childhood mementos, the memories of his youth, and burn them, as if he's trying to eradicate his past, eradicate his identity. Reggie decides that he can no longer live like this. So he decides that there's only two ways. He can either disappear in some way, or he can kill himself. So he drives a van down to a Dorset beach, takes off his clothes, leaves them on the beach, and walks out into the sea naked. He doesn't drown himself. He walks back up, puts another set of clothes on, so that he leaves his old clothes on the beach, so people think that he's drowned himself, puts on a new set of clothes, puts on a wig, and takes on a new identity. And he becomes eventually Martin Wellborn. Now, I don't want to tell you, for those of you, I mean, some of you will remember the television series, the book is fantastic in many, many ways. It takes place only over a week or two. I don't want to give away the ending. What I want to say is that what Reggie Perrin was suffering from at the age of 40-something was what we would now call, and was indeed called then, a midlife crisis. A man, usually a man, not exclusively, but in this period largely understood to be a male problem. A man between the age of about 35 and 45 in that deadline decade, realizing that his life was going nowhere, disaffected and disillusioned, would go off the rails. The midlife crisis. Now, the term had been first introduced about a decade earlier by a Canadian social scientist and psychoanalyst, Elliot Jacques. Jacques had come over from Toronto in the Second World War, had stayed. He was one of the founding members of the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations. He was a social scientist, but also a psychoanalyst. He'd been analyzed himself by Melanie Klein and had a practice as a psychoanalyst. And what he described was pretty much what Reggie Perrin experienced. And his point in Death and the Midlife Crisis, a short article published in 1965, he pointed out that the paradox is that of entering the prime of life, the stage of fulfillment. But at the same time, the prime and fulfillment are dated. Death lies beyond. So the picture that Jacques created was of this man, usually at the peak of a binomial curve of life. And when you get to that peak, all you can see is the downward curve to death. And that's the moment when anxiety, a depressive crisis, was triggered. He then went on to explain what happened to middle-aged men, or what kind of behavior they began to exhibit. And what he said was that in order to cover up this crisis, they developed a set of manic behaviors to try and convince themselves that they were still young. So the compulsive attempts to remain young, the hypochondriacal concern over health and appearance, the emergence of sexual promiscuity in order to prove youth and potency, the hollowness, lack of genuine enjoyment of life, these, he said, are familiar patterns, and they are all attempts at a race against time. So the midlife man, the man in the deadline decade, sees death accelerating towards him, and he tries to deny that or cover it up by claiming or pretending that he's younger than he is, leading to these kinds of behaviors. At the time, both in the 60s and when Reggie Perrin was having his crisis in the 70s, there were two principal explanations for the midlife crisis. The first was psychological, the kind of analysis and explanation that Elliot Jacques put forward. And that is that the midlife crisis was an identity crisis, a crisis, a depressive identity crisis, very similar to the adolescent crisis. The adolescent crisis, he thought, was a schizoid crisis, the midlife crisis, a depressive crisis. Elliot Jacques was not the only person, or certainly not the first person, to think about the stages, the critical phases of life in this way. Carl Jung in the 1930s had written about his own crisis at the age of 37, and particularly Erik Erikson, an American developmental psychologist, had talked about life, particularly in terms of the ages or the stages of life. He described life in terms of 8 stages, each of which had its own particular conflict. The stage that correlated with the period that Jacques was talking about, he thought was focused on a conflict between creativity on the one hand and stagnation on the other. And it was that that created the crisis. So there were others as well thinking, largely from a psychoanalytical point of view, about how we understood middle age and midlife. One of the important points to make about this kind of approach to middle age and midlife was that it was not just theoretical. This wasn't just a theory of how we developed. It was also incorporated into practice. And psychoanalytical models of aging became absolutely key to the work of marriage guidance counselors, for example, working for the National Marriage Guidance Council, or couples therapists working at the Tavistock Clinic, for example. Most of that was built on an understanding of individual development across the life course, through the stages, through middle age, and through the various crisis points that they could produce. So the first explanation for Reggie Perrin's crisis is that he was suffering from some identity crisis around the age of 40, 45. But there were another set of explanations, and these were biological. The first biological explanation really revolved around some of the work that Peter Medawar was interested in, old age, natural death, and the unsolved problem of biology. He was interested particularly in the evolutionary and biological dimensions of aging. And in that sense, the downward curve of life was not necessarily only an awareness of approaching death. It was something else. It was an awareness that as we get older, we get grayer or balder, or we develop middle-age spread, or our muscle mass declines, our vigor, our vitality deteriorates. And it was that sense of deteriorating vigor that fueled the crisis in some kind of ways. Now, it's not unrelated to the fear of death that Jack's described, but very much linked to that declining biological vitality that people wanted. There was, of course, another way, and there has been another way in which midlife crises have been linked to biology, and that is particularly in women in relation to reproductive life. And here the argument was, and most of the literature, certainly in this period, was on men, but there was some literature on women. And in these cases, women were understood to go through a crisis through, during, after menopause, as their reproductive functions supposedly disappeared, or in some ways through the empty nest process. So a woman's midlife crisis was tied very, very clearly to her reproductive capacity. The term biological clock, or the clock is ticking, in fact, was used by an American journalist, Richard Cohen, in 1978. But the notion that in women, their transitions and their crises might be governed by their biology or reduced to their biology was very commonplace. It perhaps won't surprise you to know that some men blamed their own midlife crises on the menopause, their wife's menopause as well. So, let me go back to Reginald Perrin and reflect for a moment. Reggie Perrin, in the late 70s, having a crisis, trying to change his life in key ways, recognizing that he perhaps hadn't achieved what he wanted and that he was disaffected and disillusioned. We can see that Perrin, we could explain that in terms of his own psychological angst. He's got to a stage, an age in his life where everything looks as if it's going downhill and only death awaits. We can also get a sense from his book that physically he's declining. Physically he no longer feels himself to be the man that he was. So we could see it very much as an individual story of a man with psychological and biological problems. What I want to suggest for the rest of the talk is that this is not the only way in which we can understand the midlife crisis. And in fact, I want to zoom out to take it away from the individual and think about the social and cultural conditions that made the midlife crisis possible, not only as a concept in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but also as a set of experience. What happened to enable the midlife crisis to emerge? Not in an individual case, but much more widely in terms of the socioeconomic and the cultural conditions. And I want to do that in two ways. In the first instance, I want to think about the standardized life course that emerged in the middle decades of the 20th century that created particular stresses on people at middle age. Secondly, I want to reflect on the meaning and the history of the phrase, life begins at 40. And at the end, I want to argue that it's those two components that played a key role in the emergence of the midlife crisis, not just Reggie Perrin's, but ours as well. So let me start reflecting for a moment on the standardized life course. There's no doubt, of course, that our life cycles, individually and collectively, are governed by our biology. But Bernice Neugarten was a very prominent psychologist in America who wrote extensively on middle age and midlife and the transitions between various life stages. And she pointed out, of course, that the timetable, the milestones of life, were not merely biological, they were also socially prescribed. So there was a socially prescribed timetable, she said, for the ordering of major life events, a time in the lifespan when men and women are expected to marry, a time to raise children, a time to retire. So the rhythm of our life, the stages of our life, the ages of our life, the transitions of our life were socially prescribed, not just biological. And of course, if they're socially prescribed, it means that they can change. Our understandings and experience can change, our expectations can change, our expectations of the life course. The life course, the life cycle did change dramatically across the early decades of the 20th century. By the 1950s and 1960s, couples were living longer. If you were born at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century in this country, we might expect to live until we were 40, 50, 60. By the 1950s, 40s, 50s, we might expect to live until we're into our 70s or perhaps 80s. So life expectancy had increased, giving us that longer life cycle and in principle also a longer period of adulthood or middle age. At the same time, we were marrying earlier. In 1911, only about 24% of women were married by the age of 24. By the early 50s, that had risen to 52%. And in fact, if you look at some of the surveys of men and women's attitudes about marriage during this period, most women would say that the ideal age to marry is between 20 and 24. Men, ideal age slightly later, but not that much different. At the same time, during the early decades of the 20th century, it became more commonplace to have fewer children and to cluster them together earlier in the marriage. So let's say a couple were married at the age of 20 or 21. By 24 or 25, they would have had their 2 or 3 children. And they would be then bringing up those children, the children would leave home. So there was a much longer period of life after the childbearing period. In a sense, in this period still, that was more important for women, who tended to be in the workplace less, by and large, and looking after the children more. Men's rhythm, the rhythm of men's life, was slightly different, dictated not so much by the rhythms of the family, but by the rhythms of occupational patterns. By the 1950s and 60s, men tended to work for a fixed number of years, often in the same job until retirement. So you can see the male life course in some ways also socially prescribed from the moment of starting work to the moment of retirement, set by the government, by the state, or by private industries. One of the consequences of this teasing out of the life course, the clustering of major life events in very similar ways across populations, meant that people began to experience much more clearly defined stages and transitions in the life course. So you could begin to identify a period of middle age between 30 and 50, 40 and 60, and we could begin to identify those critical stages of transition between those life phases. Now, the point I want to make from this is that there are a number of consequences that emerged from this modern, standardized, homogenized life course, and they link directly to the emergence of the midlife crisis. The first impact was the growth of age anxiety or age consciousness. If there were standard life courses, standard milestones against which we could measure ourselves, we became much more conscious or anxious about whether we were succeeding or failing against those milestones. So a much greater sense of where we should be at certain points in our life. And of course, that expectation that we would leave home, get married, have children, get a job, retire, our expectations were raised, but at the same time, if we didn't match up to those expectations, if we didn't meet those milestones, follow that timetable, we could be dissatisfied with our achievements. And this led, the notion, the phrase keeping up with the Joneses started in a comic strip in America in about 1913, but it became, in those early decades of the 20th century through the 30s and 40s, a key way of us measuring ourselves against others, a driver in some ways of envy and jealousy, a driver of emulation, a driver to increase our consumption to keep up with the Joneses. We were much more aware of our place in the world and particularly where we were failing. While we were becoming more aware, we were also becoming subject, in this period to very different stresses. This is the generation in the 50s and 60s, 70s, Reggie Perrin's generation, that could perhaps describe themselves as the first sandwich generation. If we think about the patterns of marriage and child rearing and aging, if you imagine that we have that couple ideally marrying at 20, have their children by 25, by the time they're 40, 45, Reggie Perrin's age, their children will be going through the troubled years of adolescence, their parents would be aging through retirement, needing more care, and you find in this period the middle-aged, between the age of 30 and 50, 40 and 60, becoming sandwiched between the troubles of their adolescent children and the troubles of their parents. So you hit the midlife crisis exactly when your children are going through an adolescent crisis. Middle age was also challenged for many people by financial pressures at this time. And again, this was a feature of the changing life cycle. In 1891, we could expect to inherit at the age of about 37. Now, I have to say that this is a middle-class Western story. This is not true of everybody, although the longer history of the midlife crisis suggests that the crisis has been democratized in many ways. But if you were lucky enough to inherit, in the late 19th century, you could expect to inherit at the age of 37. By the 1940s, you would expect to inherit not until you were 56. That meant that you inherited, it's always nice to get money, don't get me wrong, but if you inherited after you'd had children, after those children had grown up and after they left home, at times when you might not need it as much as you had when you were middle-aged bringing up children. That created a set of financial pressures on couples trying to bring up children. The final point I want to make in terms of midlife pressures, and it applies, the empty nest is as it was first introduced, the empty nest, in about 1913, it was applied largely to women in a rather derogatory way, that their only function in society was to have children, and once those children had left, they were of no value. But in some ways, it describes a very key feature of the extended life course, that by the 1950s, given the fact that women and men are marrying earlier, having their children earlier, a woman could live for a further 52 years after the birth of their last child and many years after menopause. One of the things that created in people's minds was the question, is this all there is? Do I really want to live like this with this person for the next 40 or 50 years? And a number of the psychologists in this period pointed out that the extended life course, the continued pressures at middle age, through middle age, meant that many people, when they got to the age of 40, 45, began what Robert Lee and Marjorie Kasabian referred to in the spouse gap. I don't know if you can see, Weathering the Marriage Crisis During Midolescence is the subtitle of the book. What they pointed out that the multiple stresses during middle age, that sense of recognizing that you were not achieving what you should have, according to the standardized timetable of the life course, meant that people began to reappraise their lives, to reckon the achievements against the goals, the satisfactions versus values, the kind of evaluation of his life that Reggie Perrin went through. And they began to realize, of course, that they hadn't achieved, that they were disappointed, and as a result, hit crisis point. And Margaret Mead, I've quoted here as an anthropologist in a very interesting book, Male and Female, in 1949, published in 1949, pointed out that in a world in which people may reorient their whole lives at 40 or 50, that's a world in which marriage for life becomes much more difficult. Margaret Mead's solution, and the solution of some science fiction writers, was that we should introduce the possibility of multiple serial marriages. She suggested two, but many writers at the time suggested possibly three, one for youthful passion, one for parenthood, and one for companionship in later life, that there were very different demands across that extended life course at different stages of your life. There was no reason why it shouldn't be the same person who fulfilled those sequentially, but there was no reason why it should, is what Margaret Mead was saying. Margaret Mead also appeared in a lot of BBC television programs on marriage and divorce in this period. Now, one of the consequences, one of the reasons why this was important socially and culturally, was because people were concerned in this period about the levels of divorce. And they linked midlife crisis to a marriage crisis, claiming that partly it was the behavior of middle-aged men that was threatening marriages, leading to family breakdown, separation, and divorce. And this was regarded as problematic for social stability in the post-war period. Before the Second World War, fewer than 7,000 couples were divorced. There was a big boost after the Second World War, during the late 40s to 50s, linked largely to, well, explained in terms of hasty marriages during the war, the difficulties that soldiers had readjusting to civilian life, the fact that during separation, both husbands and wives, for example, had had affairs. Those challenges led to a high level of breakdown after the Second World War. There was a little bit of a plateau and then a rise through the late 60s, 70s, and 80s. Now, I don't want to say that the midlife crisis, the challenges that people faced in middle age, were the only reasons for that. One of the reasons for the big rise after 1970 is a change in the divorce law. The Divorce Reform Act was introduced in 1969, removed the marital offence and replaced it with the notion of irretrievable breakdown, making it much easier for some people to get a divorce. But debates about the midlife crisis in this period, and still, I think, link it very closely to concerns about the stability of marriage, which was regarded by many as essential for social stability. Let me pause for a moment then and think again about Reggie. Yes, distraught. Yes, going through a period of psychological angst. Yes, fading biologically. But also, in some ways, a victim of very striking demographic changes across the 20th century, of very different expectations of the milestones of life, the expectations about when people would get married, have children, get a job, retire, and so forth, created a set of pressures on Reggie Perrin and his wife and his children that proved for him too much. In some ways, what I've sketched out is what Reggie Perrin was escaping from. The stick that pushed him to behave in these ways was the social pressures created by the extended standardized life course. But what did he hope to achieve by it? If that was what he wanted to escape from, where was he expecting to go? What were the benefits of changing his life in this kind of way? And I want to reflect on that, not just the push out of the mess that he felt he was in, but the pull towards a better life. I want to explore that just by thinking about the phrase, life begins at 40, and where that came from, and how that played in to the expectations and the aspirations, not just of Reggie Perrin, but also many of us as well. The phrase, life begins at 40, was first used, well, as far as we know, in 1917 by Mrs. Theodore Parsons, Matilda Parsons, who was the widow of an army officer, but had already had her career as well, teaching particularly young women and girls and young women and older women how to keep fit. Scientific bodybuilding is what she referred to it as. And partly it was keeping physically fit in order to keep the mind fit. And this phrase, I love, she was interviewed in 1917 for the newspaper. It was 4 days after America entered the First World War. And in the interview, she said, and a very similar set of ideas to what Elliot Jacks introduced much later in the 60s. It's a paradox of life, she said, that we do not begin to live until we begin to die. Death begins at 30. That is deterioration of the muscle cells set in. Most old age is premature, and attention to diet and exercise would enable men and women to live a great deal longer than they do today. The best part of a woman's life begins at 40. That was her phrase. Now, there's a particular context to what Mrs. Parsons was saying. And again, this is part of the argument that unless we understand the social and cultural context, we don't fully recognize the meaning of that kind of term. Theodore Parsons, Mrs. Parsons, directed her comments at what she referred to as the adipose woman of 40. She was addressing middle-aged women who she felt had let themselves go. And the reason why this was important to Mrs. Parsons was because of the war effort. Men were away fighting. Women were needed to bring up children, to do the work, to support the communities economically while their men were away. So it became crucial to her that women retain their fitness, physically and mentally, as they aged. That notion, it's really interesting that as the notion life begins at 40 became popular, the first part of that sentence, the best part of a woman's life begins at 40, got lost in some kind of translation. It became simply life begins at 40, and it was popularized in a whole variety of ways during the 1920s and 1930s. The most common way, or the most popular book, was Walter Pitkin's book entitled Life Begins at 40. Pitkin was an American journalist working at Columbia University and had taken this notion that life begins at 40 to write a self-help book. And you can see from the cover of the book, through this book's inspiring and helpful advice, thousands of men and women fearful of middle age have lost their anxieties and found new ways to make life richer, happier, and more worth living. This was the blurb on the book to try and sell it. And the notion, both Pitkin's book and that phrase, life begins at 40, were used in other areas. Life Begins at 40 was a film in 1935 starring Will Rogers that was based on the book. And there were some skits, there were some satires as well of this. A great film in the late 1930s entitled Life Begins at 8:30. So the idea that life could begin rather than end at midlife, at middle age, became a key part of self-help literature and advice to middle-aged couples during the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So what did Pitkin advise people in order to find these new ways of being happy? In fact, it was pretty bland and mundane. He pointed out that happiness comes most easily after 40, firstly by realizing that a great many years lie between 40 and 70. Now that that might seem fairly banal, and I think it probably is, but it's a twisting on its head of the concerns of midlife. Midlife, Reggie Perrin's looking back and saying, I haven't achieved anything, I've got nothing left to look forward to. What Pitkin is saying is, yes, you have. Even at the age of 40, you're going to have 20, 30, 40 years of your life. Still, make the most of it. And the way you made the most of it, according to Pitkin, was that you pursue self-fulfillment through material improvement, leisure, and what he called the art of living. Much less work, more leisure, more pleasure. This process of self-fulfillment would make those last 30 or 40 years worthwhile. No longer the downward curve, no longer the acceleration towards death, but in fact a fulfilling middle age and older age. And this notion became widely adopted in two particular ways. One is that it was taken as a strategy for personal renewal. This is a way in which we could refresh and renew ourselves when we were getting jaded and faded in middle age. Begin to realize that there were things to look forward to, that it was possible to reshape, to remold a life in more positive ways. But the key part of this, and again thinking about this in social and cultural historical terms, the key part of this is this story that Pitkin was telling was not just about individuals discovering themselves. It was also a lesson, a message for populations, certainly in America and Britain, during a period of economic depression, during a period of recession, increasingly concerned about the spectre of a Second World War, during a period of doom and gloom, that if we reinvigorated ourselves, there was hope for optimism. And Pitkin's argument was that if people, as they got older, the middle-aged and the elderly, worked less and had more leisure, there would be more job opportunities for younger people, which would boost the economy. Equally, if people in middle age and older age spent their money buying things, enjoying themselves, purchasing leisure, for example, and pleasure, that would also boost the economy. So part of the appeal of Pitkin's work was that it struck a chord in individuals, like Reggie Perrin, who were struggling with their own problems, but it also meant something to a Western world struggling with the effects of economic recession, because it promised a way out of them. And in some ways, Pitkin writing in the 30s, the 1930s were a strangely paradoxical period. A period of morbid gloom in some kind of ways because of the recession and because of the fear of another global war. But it was also a period of incredible optimism. It was the period when the American dream was conceived. And the American dream first appeared in the work of James Truslow Adams in 1931, the year before Pitkin published Life Begins at 40. And it's in the epilogue to this fantastic overview, the Epic of America. And in that epilogue, he tries to sketch out the future, to move away from some of the doom and gloom of the interwar period, to say life, globally as well as individually, doesn't have to go down towards death and destruction. It can go the other way. And for Adams, the American dream was not a dream simply of motor cars and high wages, so it's not just a material dream, but a dream of a social order in which each man and woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of which they're innately capable and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of birth or position. So this was Adams' dream, and it was a dream in a sense that resonated very clearly with what Pitkin was saying. We didn't have to be depressed at midlife, at the middle of the 20th century either. We could look forward with some hope. For this to happen, Adams argued, we needed to develop a new scale and basis for values. For Adams, looking forward to achieving the American dream, that meant collectivity, trust, love, working together to make a better world. So here was this period of economic recession, Pitkin saying, yes, life can begin at 40. Adams saying, in fact, there is an American dream that we should work towards. In some ways, of course, what happened was the opposite. Those hopes and those dreams were dashed. They were dashed by the Second World War. They were dashed by the catastrophe of global conflict. And they were dashed in many ways by what happened afterwards in terms of the Cold War. That sense of optimism that could create security, or the sense of security that could create optimism, they were dashed during the Second World War and afterwards. What was left of Pitkin's mantra and Adams' dream was simply a dream of material plenty. The values, the scale, the basis of values, that dream of social order that was democratic and egalitarian, equal opportunities, occupationally and educationally, that was shattered by experiences in the Second World War. What was left was the dream of motor cars and high wages. People were left feeling that they could not achieve those other grandiose aspirations that Pitkin and Adams had set out. Instead, what they tended to do was search for happiness in a hurry. This is a wonderful book by Edmund Burglar, The Revolt of the Middle-Aged Man. Published in 1958, that Edmund Burglar was an American psychoanalyst who had a very extensive clinic, and he drew on his clinical experience to write about a whole variety of challenges relating to marriage, middle age, and midlife in particular in relation to men. He has a lovely book published in 1948 saying divorce won't help, if anybody is interested. And his argument, in fact, in that book and in this book, is that before a couple run to the divorce lawyer, they should go and see a psychiatrist. That this is about the challenges within themselves and their relationships. So what he says is that during the 40s and 50s, the collapse of the American dream in many ways, and you can trace this through American post-war literature as well in particular, the collapse of the dream left people struggling. And they translated those struggles or those aspirations into a dream of material plenty, into consumption, seduced by the pleasure of consuming material goods, but also the pleasure, the anticipation of consuming other people. This was the emergence, if you like, of a form of narcissistic self-fulfillment that drove some of the behavior that you see in Reggie Perrin. So for burglar, people were looking for happiness in a hurry. And he has this beautiful passage which describes very, very clearly the thought processes that he attributes to people like Reggie Perrin. In this mindset, stressed by life circumstances, feeling that they had failed, feeling that although they were looking down to death, everybody was telling them that life begins at 40 and things should be getting better, at that moment they were anxious and perhaps more depressed than they would have been otherwise. And this is the mindset, if you like, of a Reggie Perrin. I want happiness, love, approval, admiration, sex, youth. All this is denied me in this stale marriage to an elderly, sickly, complaining, nagging wife. Let's get rid of her. Start life all over again with another woman. Sure, I'll provide for my first wife and children. Sure, I'm sorry the first marriage didn't work out. But self-defense comes first. I just have to save myself. So what is left of those aspirations in the midst of midlife, middle-age stress, the argument that life should be getting better, not worse, that optimism that we could achieve the American dream, as that was dashed, what was left was a sense of selfish, narcissistic belief that we were due some things, some happiness ourselves. And this, Burglar suggested, was why people like Reggie Perrin had crises, pushed from their marriages, pushed from their relationships, disappointed in their lives, but seduced by a dream that was no longer achievable, except through the selfish pursuit of pleasure. Let me reflect then, to finish, on where we've been. Reggie Perrin, in some ways, spoke for a generation. He was an everyman, if you like, and his wife and children everyday victims of the kinds of pressures that people and families were under in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We can certainly understand his behavior, that random, impulsive, destructive behavior, as the product of psychological despair. I've hit my peak, I've reached my prime, but it no longer means anything, because all I look forward to is the downward curve of life and death. There's that sense of an identity crisis that is captured very, very neatly by David Nobbs, but also you can see it in other literary and cinematic forms as well in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Or we can read it in biological terms. We can say that Perrin is aging. He's losing his virility, he's losing his hair, he's losing muscle mass and energy. And that leads him into a crisis of despair as well, linked to death, but not entirely the same. We can see this in individual terms. This is a man behaving strangely. What I want to suggest, though, is that we cannot understand Reggie unless we cast our lens wider than that, unless we zoom out to see the social and the cultural conditions in which Reggie Perrin was living and in which we continue to live in some ways. So there are perhaps two conclusions that I want to make. The first is that we are aged, Reggie, us, we are aged not just by our minds and bodies, but we are also aged by history, by the cultural values, the attitudes, the beliefs, the norms, the practices that we have inherited from the past. In some ways, Reggie Perrin in the late 70s went off the rails because of what had happened in the 1950s and 60s, both in terms of the life course and in terms of the seduction of materialism. The second point is this, that in that context, when we are saying that we're aged by history and culture, within that context, the midlife crisis is no longer the biological, the natural phenomenon, the inevitable phenomenon of aging. It is immediately a social and a cultural phenomenon. The midlife crisis that Reggie suffered from, that we perhaps continue to suffer from, is a set of experiences that is generated by historical change, shaped by cultural context and socio-economic conditions, and determined also by political contingencies. Thank you.
Wonderful. So, thank you for that very thought-provoking lecture, Professor Jackson. Will you be kind enough to take questions?
Of course.
We have some roving microphones. Somebody there at the back with that orange sweater.
Thank you. That was really refreshing and fascinating. Thank you very much. What was I going to say? First of all, it's interesting you mentioned Margaret Mead. My understanding is this was the same lady that went to certain places in Samoa and found there were different types of living conditions where it was the men that dressed up and were kind of the ones that were looked at, and it was the women that kind of did the so-called stereotypical men work. So it's quite interesting. I don't know what you think about this. As you were talking, I was wondering, do you think, because you said this is the Western kind of middle class thing, do you think it's actually related to the idea of adolescence and the development of adolescence? Because in some countries, they don't have adolescence. They have either you're a child or you're an adult. When you're an adult, certain things happen to you, etc., etc. And I'm wondering, because there's this kind of, this gap or this kind of hiatus between, it's getting longer and longer from what I can see, between being a kind of child type of adolescence to adulthood, I wondered if that kind of contributed to this idea of life beginning at 40. I could be wrong, but I just wondered.
Thank you very much. There's a couple of really nice questions there. Mead, you're absolutely right. Travelled, used anthropological, cultural comparisons to draw some of her conclusions. And in fact, the book Male and Female was based on a cultural comparison between the life cycle in America and in various other South Sea islands. So it was a very much a comparative study of life cycles. What she did notice in some of that work was that there was something distinctive about the American way of living and the American lifestyle. And there were other studies around this period and afterwards as well, showing that in different cultures, people age themselves in different ways. One of the dominant Western sort of paradigms of aging is we count down to death or up to death. So we mark birthdays, 10th, 20th, 30th, 40th, 50th. There's a very calendrical view of the life cycle in the West. In many other cultures, that might not be the same, that they measure their life course in very different ways around social events, grandparents, for example. Life course. And it was one of the things, it certainly came out of some of Margaret Mead's work, but also work on the history of the life course in Japan and family structures in different cultures. The question about adolescence is also interesting because I was talking about menopause and to some extent the extending of middle age. One of the interesting things again is that we tend to regard both adolescence or puberty and menopause as biologically determined. And yet, if you look at the work of people like Margaret Locke, it's very clear that different cultures experience both adolescence and menopause in very, very different ways, right down to the symptomatology. In some cultures, women, for example, at menopause do not report that they have hot flashes or headaches or whatever it might be. Very different set of cultural expectations around those transitions in the life course. And that creates a certain set of expectations, or the absence of expectations, meaning that the story I've told in some ways is quite distinctive to a time and a place, that even the notions of adolescence or midolescence or midlife crisis can mean very different things. In most of the literature on the midlife crisis, the key connection to adolescence is not so much the distance between them, but that in the modern life course, the midlife crisis of parents tends to coincide with the adolescence of children. And it's that temporal coincidence that partly triggers the midlife crisis. It may also, of course, trigger the adolescent crisis.
Thanks very much. We've just had Deaf Awareness Week. I want to mention something about deafness. about 20 odd years ago. I wouldn't have been able to come to your lecture because I wouldn't be able to follow it.
Yep.
This has been going on for 20 years, slowly. It's a very big thing. In other words, it's improving my quality of life. So that's a good thing. But my puzzle is, when people put two words together, can you give me an idea but they make sense? And that is the male menopause.
Yeah. Yep. No, that's lovely. I mean, the first point is a really interesting one, because you're absolutely right that our experiences of aging have been transformed quite distinctly, partly because of scientific and technological changes, and that does shape our experiences and expectations as well. That's a really nice point. The male menopause is really interesting. The notion of a male climacteric, which is what it was first called, appeared in the 19th century. And it was thought to be comparable to menopause in women. Not as obvious, not as sudden, not as drastic, not as critical, but a period when hormonal changes led to particular psychological and biological manifestations. During the course of the 20th century, that idea that men went through a menopause or an andropause or a male menopause came and went. The general feeling now is that this describes a gradual decline in physical, sexual, emotive potency. Where we sit, I think we have to see that as very culturally embedded as well, just as the woman's menopause just as women age in certain ways, men do as well. I think in some ways scientifically the jury is out about the male menopause. In some ways, it can be seen as comparable to, but also a rationalization of, the way in which men age.
Over there, please.
Hi, thanks. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed that. I was thinking about there was a third and final series of Reggie Perrin that wasn't shown very often, where he sort of drops out completely and forms a commune, if I remember.
Yes.
It's quite a long time ago since I've seen it, but I was sort of thinking about what was sort of socially acceptable, because you talked a lot about sort of keeping up with the Joneses.
Yes.
As the sort of counterculture took hold in the 60s and 70s, did the idea of just dropping out completely and saying, I reject everything, become more potent?
Yeah, that's a really nice point as well. I mean, you have to understand that the Reggie Perrin story, I mean, you're right, there was a Christmas episode and there are some subsequent stories that were actually very poorly received. I think the first three series were fantastically popular. After that, the sense is that Nobbs and others lost the plot a little bit. Part of the story of Perrin in the 70s is a story about reaffirming traditional values. So when the midlife crisis emerged first, and where it was discussed in the context of marriage and divorce, the narrative line was, how do you step away from, but at the same time return to your marriage? So the story, the moral behind a lot of this is quite conservative. How do we re-embed men in the home? And in fact, of course, that's what happens to Perrin at the start. He goes off as Martin Wellborn and in fact goes back to his wife, who doesn't or does recognize him, and remarries him. And actually at one point, Perrin's daughter says to his mum, you do realize who that is? And his mum's, her mum, Elizabeth, says, yes, I know who it is, but the marriage wasn't working before and now it will. It's the same man, but he looks different. So that early series was very much about how you break away, but also reinforce the values of family and society. By the 1970s and 80s, by the 80s, that was beginning to break down, and you see in a lot of the literature a much more dramatic rejection of midlife, of consumer capitalist values at midlife. So novelists in particular are playing with this all the time. How far can I push this? What will be acceptable to the audience in terms of what they recognize, and what is it that we're trying to destroy here or to remake? So I think in the 60s and 70s, what you get is a very conventional Perrin who goes off, has his crisis, and comes back and is saved by his wife, which is a familiar narrative in most of the midlife novels. By the 80s, that's beginning to break down, and people are pushing the boundaries, saying, let's reject this even further. Let's go off and travel, give up my job, change partners, whatever, in a very different way.
I think just one more. Would you like it?
Sorry to get the last question. I just want to say thank you very much. You've cheered me up no end. I don't feel quite so guilty about my first divorce anymore. So there are all sorts of factors impounding my divorce, and it wasn't just me and all my mistakes. So it's interesting to look at the decades and the economics and the warfare and all sorts of other factors that might come in to have created divorces and midlife crisis. What I'm interested in is today looking forwards. So how do you see midlife crisis affecting us in the next decade or two?
Speaking personally, no, I'm well beyond a midlife crisis. I'm sure there are, well, according to Elliot Jacks, there was a crisis at 37, midlife, and there was another crisis at 60. I'm 60 in September, so maybe I have some hope. But it's a very interesting question, because you're absolutely right. If I'm arguing that the midlife crisis is the product of a particular time and a place, then that time changes as well. That standardized life course that created the conditions for Reggie Perrin to go off the rails was very culturally and historically specific. What tended to happen to the life course in the 70s and 80s is that standardized life course began to fragment. People began to marry later or not marry. They had children later, fewer children, or they didn't have children. So that idea of the standard, normal family timetable began to disintegrate. Now, far be it from me as a historian to predict the future, but of course you're absolutely right that we can expect changes both to our experiences of aging through middle age into later life and our experiences of crises and transitions, because that standard life course did begin to break down, has already broken down. I still think that we are trapped by it. I think those ideals, the ideals that certainly ran through my parents, are still affecting us, but you're absolutely right that as there is historical and cultural change, we can expect the middle age crisis and midlife to be different.
Well, I think we'll have to leave it there for time constraints, but I hope people will have a chance to talk to Professor Jackson afterwards. And it's my pleasure and privilege now to present you with a medal and a scroll on behalf of the Royal Society. Shall we just go over there?
Thank you. Yeah, you can do what you like.
Get a nice photo. Yeah, there we go. That's for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was okay.
Wonderful. Yeah, wonderful. Marvellous.
Thank you very much, John.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for coming. I'm sure we've shown our appreciation for Professor Jackson. There are some drinks in the City of London rooms for his guests. And once again, thank you very much for your attendance. Brilliant.
Thank you very much, John.
Yeah, fabulous.